صراعات طويلة الأمد تخبط فيها الشرق الأوسط منذ عقود، وتعقدت خيوطها وتشابكت مصالحها، حتى باتت بعض النزاعات تورث جيلاً بعد جيل بالشرق الأوسط. ما في شيء ثابت، التحالفات بتتبدل، واللاعبين على ساحة الشرق الأوسط بيتحركوا دايماً خلف الكواليس بين صفقات ومواجهات مفتوحة، من القضية الفلسطينية للحرب السورية، من الملف النووي الإيراني لأزمة لبنان المتجددة، كلها جبهات مفتوحة برقعة واحدة أنهكتها هيدي التوترات طويلاً. ولكن يبدو أن الإدارة الأمريكية الجديدة منشغلة بتسويات على أكثر من جبهة وفتح ملفات إقليمية على طاولة القرار الأمريكي. ومنذ تولي الرئيس ترامب سدة الرئاسة للمرة الثانية بدأنا نسمع بخرائط ترسم من جديد، ورفع أو تجميد عقوبات، وتحضيرات لمشهد قد يحمل معه نهاية الصراعات أو بداية توازنات مختلفة تماماً عما عاش الشرق الأوسط حتى الآن. بهذا المشهد المتقلب بنبحث بحلقة هذا الأسبوع عن قراءة عميقة وفهم واضح مع أحد أبرز الخبراء يلي شاركوا بصياغة هذه السياسات وكان له دور فاعل داخل الإدارة الأمريكية، مش بس كمحلل بل كصانع قرار أيضاً. ديفيد شينكر، المدير السابق لشؤون الشرق الأدنى في وزارة الخارجية الأمريكية وباحث رئيسي في معهد واشنطن، وخبير معروف بمواقفه الحادة وتحليلاته الدقيقة لمسار المنطقة. فما الذي تخطط له واشنطن؟ وهل فعلاً ترسم خريطة جديدة للشرق الأوسط؟ وهل التسويات الجارية تحمل في طياتها هدوءاً قادماً أم مرحلة جديدة من النفوذ والصراع؟ للخوض في عمق التوجهات الأمريكية في المنطقة نستضيف اليوم في على المحك الباحث والمحلل السياسي الأمريكي ديفيد شينكر. مساء الخير أستاذ ديفيد.
الخير مريم.
بداية أستاذ ديفيد، يعني الكوكب عم يتغير مع الرئيس دونالد ترامب. مومنتوم التسويات انطلق بكل المنطقة من أوكرانيا إلى غزة فسوريا واستطرادا لبنان ومرورا بالملف النووي الإيراني. هل ستنجح كل هذه التسويات برأيك، خصوصا يعني وأنها تتم بسرعة قياسية غير مسبوقة؟
I think Trump came into office. He said he wanted to end all the wars in the Middle East, and that he would solve the war in Ukraine in a day. These have proved more difficult, but I do believe he is committed to de-escalation and finding these type of agreements. You'll remember, President Obama won a Nobel Peace Prize for not being President Bush. President Trump got 3.5 peace agreements between Arab states and Israel and received the scorn of the world. I think he wants to get deals. Ukraine is proving more difficult than he thought. Gaza, for a host of reasons, is not making progress. And the Iran deal, I think there are some real barriers there that may be difficult to overcome. He may ultimately just get an interim deal on that. So there are some successes, but also I think many challenges that are going to persist.
برأيك أي ملف سيكون الأسرع وسنشهد على نتائجه قريبا؟
Well, listen, I think the Lebanon agreement is going pretty well. The ceasefire is holding. And 1701, the disarming of Hezbollah in the south is working. I think you have some of the pieces of the puzzle working. 1559, the disarmament in the north is moving much slower. I think sooner or later, the president is likely to get increasingly frustrated with the government of Israel on Gaza and compel maybe not a peace solution, but at least a ceasefire.
نعم، سيد شينكر، يتحدث دبلوماسيون أمريكيون على أن أذرع إيران في المنطقة هي جزء من التفاوض النووي، وإيران تنفي ذلك، لا بل تقول أن التفاوض محصور بالملف النووي فقط. ما هي حقيقة هذا الأمر؟
Well, we don't know what the truth is. One way or the other, I think, we heard from the president in his visit to Riyadh for the first time that the proxies, the terrorist organizations that Iran funds throughout the region, whether it be Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, the Hashid in Iraq, that all of these would be on the table and part of an agreement. But we're going to see going forward, much of this will depend on how badly Trump wants an agreement. I think he's made it clear that he wants to avoid war. If that involves making compromises, I think it's possible we'll see those, and that the proxies will drop from the list of U.S. demands, regrettably.
بالنسبة للشق السوري، رفع العقوبات عن سوريا أثار أسئلة كبيرة على الرغم من ارتياح الشعب السوري لهذا القرار. أبرز الأسئلة كانت كيف وافقت الولايات المتحدة على رفع العقوبات عن جهة كانت تتهمها واشنطن بالإرهاب؟ ألا تعتبر هذا خرقاً لثوابت أمريكية برأيك؟
Well, I think it's unusual, unprecedented, but at the same time, you know, we see with the economy in Syria, the total 90% of the Syrians under the poverty line, no economic life, 2 hours or less of electricity per day in Damascus, that if something wasn't done, I think we would almost be condemning the al-Shara government to failure. And we heard Secretary of State Rubio say as much. The fact is that policymaking, whether it's in the US or any other country in the world, it isn't making choices between good and bad. It's making choices between bad and worse. And so they lifted the sanctions, and they're going to give Syria a chance. And that, of course, transpired largely because of the influence of the President Erdogan in Turkey and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia.
نعم، هل هو قرار نهائي برأيك؟
No, I don't think so. You know, I'm sure we'll talk about it, but there are a list of demands or requests.
إذن هل يمكن للكونغرس أن يوقفه أو يعطله مثلا؟
Yeah, I mean, the president can only lift these sanctions because many of them are legislative sanctions. He can suspend them or lift them for 180 days. But to lift them entirely, it's the job of Congress. And I think depending on how things go on the ground, they may not make that decision to lift these permanently. But the administration can go 180 days at a time. The problem with that, of course, is that if these are only temporary lifting or suspension of sanctions, then there won't be confidence by corporations, large companies, to do major investments in Syria, knowing that they can be reversed at any point. So I'm hoping that the developments on the ground mitigate toward lifting them fully.
في الشق السوري أيضا سيد ديفيد، كيف ستوفق واشنطن ما بين حليفين لها متخاصمين في سوريا؟ هنا أتحدث عن تركيا وإسرائيل. أليس أمرا صعبا؟
Yeah, I think this is the biggest challenge. You know, President Trump, I think, has no issue with Syria becoming basically spheres of influence, sort of like Lebanon was in the 90s when Hafiz al-Assad controlled a big portion of Syria and the Israelis controlled the south. But I don't think this is a recipe for stability or for the success of Syria in the long term. You know, I think Syria should be a sovereign country without the meddling of Turkey and without the meddling of Israel. I think we see Israeli occupation of pieces of Syria right now and active military operations because they're concerned about the new government of Syria. I think over time, if confidence is built, that Israel can, you know, withdraw from the territories that it currently occupies and go back to the neutral zone, back to the border.
نعم، تعقيبا على موضوع رفع العقوبات عن سوريا، واشنطن وضعت شروطا على الرئيس الشرع في إطار رفع هذه العقوبات، وإلى الآن لم يلتزم ببعضها الشرع، مثلا حل الفصائل المسلحة. هل ستتراجع واشنطن عن رفع العقوبات في حال عدم التزامه بالشروط كافة؟
Yeah, I think that's the key issue, really. There were other requests initially made to designate the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps a terrorist organization, to have more inclusion in the constitutional committees. But when we talk about the key priorities of the United States, For President Trump, it's not governance, right? They want minorities to be treated well, but that's not the key priority. The key priority is fighting terrorism and having a military that is not brimming with foreign fighters and designated terrorists. That does not bode well for the future of Syria. To have, for example, a commander appointed by the government of Syria in the east of the country, responsible for the Kurdish population, whose militia during the war was accused of perpetrating atrocities against Kurds and Yazidis. So that's not going to help with national reconciliation and stability, and neither will I think the Congress ultimately look kindly on that when it comes time to lift permanently the sanctions.
نعم، يعني سيد ديفيد، هذا على الصعيد السوري. ماذا عن الشق اللبناني؟ كيف تقيمون أداء رئيس الجمهورية اللبناني العماد جوزيف عون في التعامل مع سلاح حزب الله الداعي إلى الحوار بدلاً من نزعه بالقوة؟
Yeah, I think in Washington there's I think pleasant surprise on how things have been going in the South. But of course, the ceasefire agreement also calls for the disarming of militias throughout the country. And I think there is a concern that President Aoun has about potential civil strife, conflict between the sectarian groups and communal tensions arising from the forced disarmament. So he has moved toward the so-called national dialogue. From my point of view, I don't think this is healthy. Lebanon most often resorts to the national dialogue on the most difficult of problems, and the dialogues go on for years and never reach any results. Hezbollah has already said, and even recently, that they will cut the hand of anyone who tries to disarm them. They're not going to do this willingly, and I think a dialogue is just an effort to stall for time while Hezbollah looks for possibilities to rebuild its decimated military infrastructure.
نعم، يعني انطلاقا من النقطة الأخيرة التي ذكرتها حضرتك، حزب الله صحيح قال أنه سيقطع اليد التي ستمتد على السلاح اللبناني، ولكن من جهة أخرى قال رئيس الحكومة اللبنانية منذ أيام نواف إسلام أن زمن تصدير الثورة الإيرانية انتهى. هل برأيك يستطيع الرئيس إسلام أن يطبق هذا الشعار؟
No, I don't believe he can do that. Really, this falls with General Aoun. President Aoun.
ما هو المانع من تطبيق هذا الشعار؟
Well, I think that he's talking about Lebanon becoming a sovereign country, and you can't have a permanent Iranian occupation of your country. As you know, Syria struggled for how many years under Syrian occupation? They ended the Syrian occupation and then had an Iranian occupation. Iran has planted Hezbollah in Lebanon as a tool to defend Iran.
إذن برأيك إيران ما زالت تتمتع بنفوذ في لبنان وحزب الله لم ينتهي كلياً؟
No, it's not finished. Hezbollah has been degraded, but of course there are still 15,000 Hezbollahis walking around with AK-47s and Coronet anti-tank weapons, and they have a long history of murdering political opponents in the country, whether this is Rafiq Hariri or Lokman Slim, my friend. They kill Twaini, they've killed Mohammed Shatta. There is a long list, and I think as long as they are armed, they are dangerous, and Iran continues to have an influence, certainly less than before, but it's not finished. And Nawaf Salam, I think his statement is helpful, that Lebanon wants to move towards sovereignty, and it can't do so while Iran is having a continued influence in this country. But this will ultimately have to be a decision made by the president for the military to take a more robust position on the disarmament north of the Litani.
نعم سيد ديفيد، لماذا تعتبر أن حزب الله لم ينتهي بعد؟ يعني اليوم بعد موت تقريبا كل الرؤوس الكبيرة في الحزب، وبعد ضرب منشآته وبعد خذلانه أمام جمهوره، لماذا لا يزال حزب الله يتمتع برأيك بقوة في لبنان؟ ولماذا لا يزال لإيران سيطرة بشكل أو بآخر على لبنان؟
Hezbollah, back in 2006, you remember, they lost, hundreds of troops. They cost $6-7 billion of damage to Lebanon. Dahya was destroyed totally. And Hezbollah was firing 100 rockets a day into Israel after 34 days, and Nasrallah declared divine victory. They are still a problem for Lebanon, even in this, degraded state that they are in. They still have an impact on the politics of Lebanon. They still have seats in parliament, and they still have weapons caches throughout the country that are preventing the country from the state establishing a monopoly on weapons. And so, through that, I believe Iran still plays a role. Certainly diminished, but still problematic. And until Hezbollah is disarmed throughout the whole country, Lebanon will not be a sovereign country.
نعم، يعني اسمح لي بالاستطراد، لاحظت خلفك في الخلفية سجادة وتبدو وكأنها عربية، هل هي إيرانية الصنع مثلا؟
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. هل هي إيه؟
هل السجادة التي خلفك إيرانية؟
Sorry, I wasn't prepared for that. Sorry. No, of course it's yes, you can add it, right? Of course, the carpet is a Persian carpet, family heirloom from my grandma, bought during the 50s in the time of the Shah.
منتابع حديثنا عن الشق اللبناني وعن زيارة المفدى الأمريكية مورغان أورتيغز. لماذا أرجأت مورغان أورتيغز زيارتها إلى لبنان؟ وهل صحيح أنها تنتظر نتائج المفاوضات الأمريكية الإيرانية؟
Yeah, I don't believe she postponed the visit to wait the outcome. It may be months until there is an outcome on this. It could be late August, one way or the other. The deadline really is October. Look, Morgan's a busy woman. She has a number of files, and not just Lebanon. She's the deputy special envoy for Witkoff, has a lot of responsibilities here in Washington. And, really at the end of the day, Morgan is in contact with the leadership of Lebanon, encouraging them to make progress on the disarmament, encouraging the government to make progress on the economic reforms. She's not going to go to Lebanon if there's not a deliverable, if there's not something that she can achieve. So I think this is sort of normal. When I served in government, I can't tell you how many visits I postponed. It's not necessarily for this larger cause.
أريد إجابة واضحة وصريحة كعادتك. واشنطن التي تسميها إيران الشيطان الأكبر تحاورت مع طهران التي تعتبرها محور الشر. هل يمكن أن نستيقظ يوما على خبر أن الولايات المتحدة تتحاور مع حزب الله مثلا؟
With President Trump, anything's possible. They sent Adam Bowler to have direct talks with Hamas in Qatar. I think for most Americans that was unthinkable. It's really unorthodox foreign policy. But the United States also ended up talking directly with the Taliban at one point. And so it's possible, but I think rather unlikely, in particular because before 9/11, Hezbollah had killed more Americans than any other terrorist group in the world. So I think there's going to be a real sensitivity to that. We'll see what happens after they disarm and just become a political party. It is the longstanding belief that in the United States that political parties don't have militias. And if this becomes a regular political party, with beliefs that we find abhorrent, but is not violent, then perhaps that could happen. And like I said, anything's possible with Trump, but I don't see it happening in the near future.
إذن يبدو أننا على أبواب مفاجآت في الشرق الأوسط. سيد ديفيد، هل يمكن أن نشهد شرقا أوسطا جديدا من دون دولة فلسطينية؟
The Kurds don't have a state. The Armenians don't have a state. There's a lot of peoples in the region who don't have a state. There's also, a lot of groups, Syrian people, 500,000 were killed. And we don't see Americans or Europeans protesting about that, or the 16 million Syrians who are driven into exile by the Bashar al-Assad regime. We don't see protests about the millions of Sudanese who are being killed. We don't see protests about Uyghur Muslims in China in concentration camps being exterminated. But Palestinian issue resonates for some reason much deeper, and the Israelis and Palestinians, live together. They live so close that I think that it's going to be a big problem if there is not a real separation, a meaningful separation ultimately between the two. So, I think we can find a modus vivendi, but ultimately there will be problems if there is not some sort of agreeable solution to the problem.
نعم، ولكن ما هو موقف واشنطن من المؤتمر الدولي الذي سيجري في باريس الشهر المقبل والذي ترعاه المملكة العربية السعودية وفرنسا من أجل حل الدولتين؟
Yeah, well, we've seen that Trump in Riyadh did not talk about a Palestinian state. He talked about Palestinians living with security and dignity. I don't believe this administration is supportive of it. I don't think they're going to show up at the conference. And of course, the Israelis have said that if this action is taken, that there will be, other consequences in terms of potential annexations in the West Bank. Listen, Palestinians have declared statehood before. They have received, observer status in the United Nations. They've been put on UN organizations. And this hasn't forwarded or advanced their cause. And so I don't know how productive it's going to be, but I don't think the administration is going to buy into that, the French-Saudi initiative.
شكرا لك سيد ديفيد شينكر على هذه المقابلة التي خصيتنا بها على المحك عبر شاشة LTV.